My name is Diane Proctor. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Concord and Carlisle, and it's an enormous privilege to have, first of all, you all coming out on this gorgeous day when you could be out gardening and doing all sorts of things. That you've come here is really appreciated, and we have an extraordinarily distinguished panel this morning. We're here to talk about the business of selecting a town manager. As most of us realize, and excuse me for not standing up, but I'm not terribly mobile right now. We've been privileged for the last 25 years to have one town manager, Chris Whalen, has done an exquisite job for our town and grown in his role, and we've grown with him. So there's been synergy between Chris's growth and the town's growth and our collective development, and so having him leave is going to be hard for the town because we've come to rely on him and rely on his knowledge and his history and his understanding. So this search process is going to be particularly important for us. And we have four, as I said, distinguished people here this morning to discuss this process with us. Tom McKean is the chairman of our select board and knows this town inside and out. He's lived here for 37 years. He brings a gentle but clear-eyed leadership to the select board. Arthur Fulman has lived in this town for 46 years and knows everything. I think he probably knows where all the, as they say, the bodies are buried. But more importantly, he's been a selectman. He served on as far as I can tell, in the list of committees, almost every major committee in town and boards.
Not the school committee.
But not the school committee. I should say, he is a smart man. Yes. He knew which committee to avoid. But at any rate, his background is vast. Nancy Tavernier is from Acton, and she has served in so many roles. Among other things, she's been in Acton. You still call them selectmen?
We do.
Okay. So she was, despite being a woman, a selectman on their Acton board, and she also was an important presence in their selection of a new town manager, a process through which they have just gone. So she will bring that perspective for us. And then Carl Valente is an experienced town manager. He's been a town manager of Lexington, the very first town manager of Weston. He served as a finance director and town administrator for the town of Needham for 13 years. And he now lives in Newton. Seems to know everybody. In fact, we were just discussing the fact that he's part of an association of town managers who gather together to collectively determine, what your problems are and how collectively to solve them. So we have a lot of experience and intelligence on this board. And I will turn them over to you. Tom, you want to start for us?
I'm happy to, thank you. I'm going to remain seated unless people find that you're unable to hear me, in which case I'm happy to stand up. But on Monday night at the special town meeting, the citizens of Concord voted affirmative action on Article 8, which provided the expenditure of up to $20,000 of funding to allow the town to hire a professional recruiting firm to conduct some advertising and incur other costs in the recruiting of a new town manager. This was a result of the fact that Chris Whalen advised us in May that this would be his last year and that he'll be retiring the end of June. Given our commitment to the strong town manager form of government, the role of the town manager is particularly important, and I think we all on the select board view that this process is probably the most important thing we'll be doing this year, even though we've got a lot of other important things that are on our plate. And we've been extremely fortunate to have had an excellent town manager for the past 25 years. So not all of us have been involved in the process of the selection of a town manager. We have already approved the charge for the town manager search committee. It's going to be a 9-member committee, 2 members from the current select board. I've already asked the 2 senior members, Mike Lawson and Alice Kaufman, to serve on that committee, and we are putting together the other 7 members who will be nominated on my expectation on our select board meeting on the 15th, and then there will be their election, or they will be appointed on the 29th. There's going to be a very strong public input process, meeting with staff. It's natural that the staff probably of any group within the town might have the most anxiety, and that they've been used to a certain form of management, and are going to want to have input and reassurance in terms of what the new town manager, how that's going to work. Also will be various committees and citizen groups. Fortunately, the town has just completed the long-range plan, which involved numerous meetings and input from a broad component of the town. The committee will be completing a job announcement and deadline for applications. You've heard a number of the neighboring towns have recently conducted searches for town manager, and I presume that the consultant will likely have names of people who are interested in appropriate candidates. One of the advantages of having a consultant is that process. Committee will set a calendar for the review of the applications, written material, and conducting the interviews. I think it's likely that there will be a recommendation of somewhere between 2 and 5 members for the full board. Likely to be 3, that seems to be the pattern, but I don't want to lock them in that they just have to pick 3. I think if they find that there may be more, that's healthy. If they find there's really only 2 that they think are excellent candidates, I think we might be able to live with that as well. We'll work with town council. There'll be the issue of compensation package will have to be dealt with, and obviously have to have a contract. I wanted to, each year, the select board does an evaluation of the town manager, and I'll just give you my perspective in terms of what I'm hoping we're going to be able to obtain in a town manager. And the last paragraph is to Chris. Although you continue to exhibit excellence in your relationship with the select board, leadership quality, superior general management and personnel management, strong communication and public relations skills, your most important asset is your personal qualities and characteristics. In the governmental structure of a strong town manager and a rotating select board, it's critical that the representation of the town maintains high standards of ethics, honesty, and integrity in personal and professional matters. It is this aspect of your role as town manager that's most appreciated. And I think that everybody's going to come with different qualities, but the most important is going to be those qualities. I think we're going to have a committee that has some experience in selecting people like that. I think that's the toughest thing. It's important they have a resume that explains their, understanding the finances of the town, understanding of dealing with various constituencies of the town, but it's the personal qualifications, the qualities of integrity and honesty that I think are most important.
Okay, I'm Art. It's interesting to be introduced as an old timer. This is a little shocking so early in the morning, although I just submitted my retirement papers as an attorney, which is even more shocking for me. But be that as it may, I've lived here since 1972, and I've served on quite a few boards and committees. The first was the Natural Resources Commission. I knew very little about environmentalism and conservation, and I got a really quick briefing and understanding of that. Most recently, I served on the Public Works Commission and the Financial Audit Advisory Committee, and in between all that, I served as a selectman from 1994 to 2000. It's been an interesting ride. I've come to love this community and to admire and respect the terrific people who staff the town on a day-to-day basis, and in particular Chris Whalen, who I'll talk about in a little bit more. I've also worked with 4 town managers. Paul Flynn was the first, followed by Steve Schaefer, Alan Edmonds, and now for the last 25 years, Chris Whalen. Each one has been different. Each one has had a different approach to how to conduct their work and the business of the town, and each one has had differing philosophies and approaches and different skills. And largely that's due to the fact that the town has changed, regulations have changed, statutes have changed, all the things that manifest themselves in how a town operates and conducts its business have been vastly modified over the years. So when you think about this, it's rather remarkable that we've operated under a charter which has been in existence. It was first adopted by town action in 1952, and then it went through a process and ultimately became effective in March 1956. And it's remarkable that there have only been 13 amendments to that charter, and most of them have been technical. Does the town manager live in town, not live in town? Is the town meeting the legislative body? How many members of this board or that board? Been some modifications, but nothing dramatic. We've not really entertained the idea of becoming a city. We've had discussions about how we operate in terms of public process, but essentially the charter, our town's constitution, is pretty much the same. There are a couple of elements of the charter which I find particularly interesting, and I know that Carl will be talking about this in more detail, but our charter provides for only 5 elected positions: the board, the select board, the school committee, the moderator, I guess it's 4, the moderator, and the representative to the housing authority. And these are, in most cases, on a staggered basis. Another thing that's interesting in how the town works, it's not in the charter, but it's a process that's been followed by people who serve the town, both in elected and appointed positions, is that in general, people serve no more than 2 terms. There are a couple of exceptions to that. The moderator obviously is a 1-year term and serves for a longer period than that. And I think the planning board, which is a 5-year term, I'm not sure whether that tradition holds in that case. But in both events, I think that's been very beneficial to the town because it's resulted in new blood coming into these various appointed positions. We don't have fiefdoms, which exist in many communities where you have elected planning board members and elected members of the Board of Health and Recreation Department and Appeals Board and other things. And I think the fact that we have this arrangement where people do not go on serving forever and ever, and where the town manager makes most of the appointments, either individually or approving those appointments required by statute by the Board of Selectmen, or in some cases, it's strictly the Board of Selectmen. The Select Board, I have to be careful in that, sorry. I think that's been very healthy for Concord. The lines of authority are very clear. Department heads report to the town manager. You don't have the chairman or the chairperson of the light board calling up the various employees in telling them what they should be doing. There's a very clear and strong lines of authority. And as a result, that creates efficiencies, which I think, again, has worked very well. Concord's charter is simple. It's 9 pages. You can read it. You can understand it. It states quite clearly what the role of the town manager is. We have a strong town manager form of governance. That's not the case in all communities. In some, there's an executive assistant or an executive secretary. In some, the select board or other governing body is much stronger in the way it controls. The select board in Concord essentially, along with most other boards in town, serve 4 principal roles. And I would define them as follows: the ceremonial roles, the meet and greet, the leading various gatherings, marching in parades. I marched in a lot of parades. That was fun. I experienced weather from 95 degrees. This is all on April 19th, by the way. From 95 degrees down to as low as 40 and somewhat lower with a bit of snow. So, you never know what you're in for when you run for that position. But in any case, you have the ceremonial role. You have the educational role, where you're responsible for educating the public on what you do, how you do it, what you think needs to be done, and what the best way is to execute that role. You have the adjudicatory role. Love that as a lawyer. You conduct hearings. On the light board, we set rates. On public works, we set rates for water and sewer. For the select board, you issue licenses. You have dog hearings, one of my all-time favorites.
Not mine.
Anyway, you have most of those are set forth in Massachusetts statutes, and you have to conduct yourself in a very official way, maintain a record, and doing all these sorts of things. And then the final role that I would mention is that of developing policy. And policy is sort of looking at the long term. What do you do as a town, and how do you administer the business of the community? And that's a role where the select board in particular and other boards, committees, and commissions play a very important role with the town manager, because the town manager, and particularly where you have a strong town manager, is charged with executing the policies that get adopted by the various boards and committees and by town meetings. So if there's a new policy in terms of some long-term goal, environmental interests, access to public lands, acquisition of public lands, greater interest in developing commercialism or protecting the environment, or in more recently where we've really tried hard to, as a town, develop very important sustainability goals and reduce our carbon footprint and do things that I think are quite progressive. That doesn't happen overnight. You have to have discussions and meetings and bring the public on board with all of this. And this is generally formulated by the various boards, committees, and commissions under the leadership of the select board and under the leadership of the town manager. So you get very involved with that. And policy development is a particularly important role. Now, historically, the select board was not quite as hands-on as it is today. That may seem odd given the fact that in the old days you would think that they do more, but the reality is that there are so many boards and committees now and commissions and so much regulation to deal with that each member of the select board is now monitoring in their liaison capacity all kinds of other boards and committees. I mean, I don't know how many you have, but you probably have up to 8 or 10 per person. Yeah. And there are only so many nights in a week that you can go out and attend meetings, and it's pretty exhausting. So, in the old days, my old days in the late 1990s, I could manage that. I could go to school committee meetings, maybe one other committee, and that was manageable. But today, I just see the people who attend the various committees and boards that I've served on. It's pretty daunting. So there's an effort, a greater effort, to be involved and stay in touch with all of that. And the people who do this liaison work for the select board are very similar to the people in the league who also serve as liaison and attend the various board meetings, because they report on to, in the case of the select board, each other and the town manager, and in some cases department heads, just as your liaison people report back to the league. And that, by the way, is critical. I have to tell you that the job that the liaison people do on the various boards and commissions is terrific. You keep us honest, you pay attention, you raise issues, you inform the town manager, you inform the select board. And it's only through that information that the town leadership and staff get a sense of what people are really thinking in the community. And that is absolutely vital. I mean, it's so good when you get a call. You know, all the calls aren't nice and friendly, but at least you know what people are thinking, and you know if you're going in the wrong direction, and you know if you're heading into a big controversy. And there are always controversies, and it's usually the small things that are mostly controversial, and the big things, the huge budgets that go through because they're processed so well, they get adopted so quickly in town after being filtered through the finance committee and all sorts of other groups. So that's the efficiency of the town, and that's attributable in large part to the town manager and the town manager's staff and the staffs of the many boards and commissions. And in thinking about Chris, who's leaving, and it's his time. It's appropriate. He's been here 25 years. He deserves a rest. And he came here. He was a young guy. He was a firecracker. I'm not sure he knew exactly what he was getting into in this town. But boy, he grew with us, and he really did terrific things. And I'm going to mention some of the characteristics of what I think a good replacement should have as the search committee does its work. But I think the most important thing that Chris did, and I want to really emphasize this, is over time he hired an absolutely fantastic staff. All these boards, Public Works, the Light Board, Finance, all these different groups that I've interacted with pretty closely over the years, I could see the fingerprints of the interaction between those heads, those department heads, and Chris, and how they all worked so well together. And because Chris emphasized autonomy and worked hard to develop a very good staff, the town has really benefited from that. So I want to emphasize that point. In terms of what the selection committee should be looking for, I list these items. They're not all inclusive, and I'm not listing them in any particular order. They just are sort of what came to mind as I thought about today. Clearly, prior experience is very important. Second, intelligence, verbal, written, and financial skills. Third, town managers should be a good listener and a good advocate. A good advocate, you have to get up at town meeting, you have to make presentations. A good listener, you have to listen to your department heads. You must like people. You have to enjoy working with a variety of constituencies. You know, Concord, we think we're a terrific community, you know, almost perfect. Well, we're good. Not necessarily the best, but we're right up there. And, you know, you get a lot of people out there who have a lot of different interests, pet peeves, pet projects, and you have to be able to juggle that and deal with that and understand that when someone's complaining about what's going on in conservation land, that's one group. Dogs, no dogs, all of that, hot issue. You know, back in my day, it was affordable housing on the Willard School campus. That was a horrible issue to deal with. We had fights over people should be able to vote by ballot away from town meeting. Should we have a different form of governance? You have to deal with all of these different interests and issues. You need someone who is well organized, a good leader of staff, and skilled in hiring top staff, as I mentioned. must be comfortable delegating responsibility to staff and understanding his or her own limits. Chris was terrific in many things. Finance, good, but that was not his strength. Don't tell him I said that, but he would admit it.
We are being recorded.
It's okay. Sorry, Chris. But I think
just edit that.
No. Leave it in. Chris had Tony Legalbo, and now he has a new finance director, Kelly. I mean, these people are talented. So he doesn't have to know everything about everything. He can rely on a very strong and supportive staff and allow them the autonomy, allow them to go to training seminars and interact with all the new work that's being done in their field. In that vein, must be a strong supporter of staff training and staff advancement and autonomy, all three very important issues. We were lucky because Chris created such an excellent leadership team. Accessibility is also very important. Some town managers don't want to be out there all the time. They're happy to deal with the staff, but they don't want to interact so much and so often with the public as they might be better advised to deal with. And I saw that in the different approaches of the 4 town managers I've mentioned. The other thing I want to mention is from the point of view of the board, of the select board, and that is, I don't know how many of you will remember this, but in the early 2000s, Chris had a new select board, some new members, and there were some pretty difficult issues that were hitting him, and in terms of at least one select board member that I can remember who was really challenging Chris's authority and thought things should be done in a different way. And after a few months, Chris was really frustrated and was about to quit. In fact, he may have actually quit. But in any event, the select board, some members of the then select board, and some prior members of the board worked out an arrangement where Chris took a 6-month sabbatical. And that was very important because if we had lost him, we would have lost a great developing, at that time, talent. And he came back refreshed, and the town was able to reset. I think the board was able to review how they had approached some of the issues and what needed to be done to make the situation a more workable arrangement. I mention that because I think it's very important that the select board recognize that the role of a town manager today is a really tough one. It's not what it was in Paul Flynn's day. It involves dealing with many constituencies and all the complexities of life and governance. And the select board needs to be sensitive to that in both hiring and in working with whoever is next. I suspect we all take a lot for granted in our working with Chris because he's been around, he understands, we know him, he knows us for the most part. With a new person, that won't be the case, and we're going to have to work at it to make it a very good relationship. So, thank you.
Okay, hi, Nancy Tavernier, and thank you to the League for inviting me to tell you about Acton's experience, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. Vice versa. We just hired a new town manager in Acton after nearly a year working on the hiring. Our Concord resident, Steve Ledoux, was our town manager. He gave us a year's notice, which you have had too, which was very helpful. And we now have a new town manager, John Maggiorati, from the town of Westford. And everything is fine a year later. So I've provided a handout. In fact, it's the last page in the handouts here that has a timeline, just to give you an idea of each month what activities we did and how many meetings we had. And it may help you appreciate the complexity of the task, although Art certainly has done that, and the commitment that committee members have to make to this. We were appointed in July 2017. The new town manager began work in 2018, and we were just dissolved last month, so it was a good 12 months process.
So you worked with the person for the first year or stayed close? That was the new town manager?
No, he's just started.
He's just starting,
in
okay.
July, yeah. It
Okay.
took, Ledoux stayed in office until June 30th.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
So the first step was choosing a committee. And the chairman of the Board of Selectmen and vice chairman found that they would select a chairman of this committee first. And they offered the position to your assistant town clerk, Pat Clifford. And it was a brilliant appointment because she's a very hard worker, and very well organized, and we were very lucky to have her skills. The rest of the 9-member committee was appointed by the selectmen, but the process they used was each of them nominated a handful of people and gave it to the chairman, and the chairman sifted through, and a lot of them were the same names, so ended up with 9 people with the following criteria. In our case, no active selectmen were on the committee. You had to be knowledgeable about town government, you had collaborative, open-minded, and definitely prepared to invest a lot of time and effort in the process. Also, prior experience on a search committee was a plus. And so we ended up with former selectmen, a couple of former school committee people, finance committee people, and 4 people who had served on the 2007 search committee when Ledoux was hired. And we worked well, like a fine-tuned machine, and it was a remarkable group. So the second task was the selectmen developed a committee charge, and they used the previous search committee's example as a guide, but the primary mission obviously was to identify the best qualified candidates to submit to the selectmen at the end. So at our first meeting, we were given training on the open meeting law and the public records law by our town council. And it was stressed over and over, and I have to stress to you how important confidentiality is to this process. You will find that potential candidates will need to be reassured that their names are not made public until they are finalists. Many of these people, no one has any idea they're out looking or even considering changing, and it can be very critical times for them. They may be in the midst of a reevaluation process or whatever. And with Google out there, Google, you find out everything you need to know. So that is very important. And to that end, we had a dedicated email shell for the committee that, I don't know the technology, but it did not go through the town server perhaps, but in any case, there was a firewall between our material and the town organization. And the open meeting law does not allow a committee to communicate, personally with personal emails, so we absolutely had to use this firewall system. And another issue we dealt with is the potential of having internal candidates. You don't want them to be able to access any of this material that is confidential to the committee. But you do still need to coordinate activities with the town staff, meeting space, things like that. So we dealt with the HR director primarily. So the next step was to create an ideal candidate profile and challenge statement, which is fairly standard when you look at the language other towns have used. It's, first thing is you want someone with integrity. Yeah, no kidding. So that's also in here. But, there are a lot of things that are kind of boilerplate, but anyway. So we were actually, the first step was we were surprised to find out there was no job description for our town manager. And we interviewed Steve Ledoux, one of our second meetings, and no, I never had a job description. Well, how'd you know what to do? Well, you start with a charter. The charter tells you what your job is, what your responsibility is, who you report to, and so forth. So we decided not to spend time trying to create one. We just included the charter in our records. So we did not set out to hire a consultant. We didn't have one in 2007. And if you lived in Acton and knew who these 9 members were, they're not exactly shrinking violets, and they're not the type to have a consultant do their work for them. So it was not our intention to hire a consultant. We thought we could do just fine. But we were beginning to hear that there weren't many candidates out there. And we began to feel like we didn't have the ability to beat the bushes. And that's something that the consultant absolutely would be hired to do, is recruitment. So we interviewed 4 consultants right off the bat, just to find out what they do, what their budget would be, how they would interact with us, and so forth. We hadn't decided to have one yet, but we interviewed 4. And later, we did decide to do it, and we hired Municipal Resources, Inc., based in New Hampshire. And looking back, we decided there's no way we could have done this without a consultant. But being that we're independent thinkers, we didn't exactly accept what the consultant's process was. We created a very specific, limited job description, ended up calling them hybrid consultants. So they had a little bit of control, we had a little bit of control. And I think it worked out fine. In the end, they respected our uniqueness, and I think they learned a lot. And they learned to be flexible, for sure. And we felt like we had not lost control and had not delegated our most important responsibilities. So their job was to receive all communication from the candidates and applications. There weren't applications per se, that's not done anymore apparently. It's a letter of interest and maybe a resume, but there's no formal application. So, and again, the candidates, often would contact the consultants and say, are you sure this is confidential? I don't want to have my name out there anywhere. And that encourages good candidates to apply, even if they hadn't been thinking about applying, as long as they're assured that there's no publicity about it. So I would say there are 4 phases of the town manager search process. The first was the market. You have to assess what the market is from the viewpoint of recruitment and speculate how many potential candidates there might be. I mean, a year later now, there were a lot of job openings for town managers that weren't the case. So now you have a time issue. You may have good candidates who are being snapped up by other towns. And that's a very different situation than we had. We surveyed the advertising venues that are used for municipal recruiting to see how many positions are currently open, and Googled, to find out who were finalists in other towns, just to get an idea of the size and quality of the pool. Phase 2 kind of ran simultaneously with phase 1, and that's public outreach. Well, all of our meetings are open to the public except for the executive sessions. No one really came, that's the bottom line. It's not the most exciting topic in town. So we felt we had to engage the community as much as possible so that we wouldn't be criticized for lack of transparency. We created a web page that had our agenda and our minutes and all other documents like the charter, the charge, all of those, and we updated that constantly. We created a survey for residents to fill out online or by paper format, and the compiled responses were put on the website. We organized a public forum for people to come and speak about the characteristics and qualifications they want to see in a town manager, and we televised it. And then we interviewed 20 department leaders individually to help us understand the work environment of the town departments and what their priorities and goals are going forward. The insight that we gained from all of these outreach efforts did inform our interim decisions and final candidate evaluations. We did all of these outreach things ourselves, whereas that's something that is normally done by the consultant. But after finishing these efforts, don't forget we're still at phase 1 and phase 2 together, that's when we said we need a consultant and put out an RFP. And as I said, selected Municipal Resources, Inc. With the consultant's help, then, we created the ideal candidate profile and wrote the position vacancy advertisement. We chose to hire a consultant in an effort to manage what we believe to be our potential risk, not a big enough pool of candidates. So we needed the consultants to actively recruit for us. And that's something they all, that's number 1 task on their list. And that meant even people who weren't even looking. All consultants have this group of people in their heads that they try to match up in their minds. And so even if they're not looking, they helped recruit in that way. But again, they were keeping it confidential. And we obviously accomplished our objective because we got 60 applications in the end. Yeah. But one example is one of our advertising venues was the Boston Globe. And, we got applications from people who work in McDonald's or, retail. People have no concept of what a town manager is, never mind the skills, but that's all right. So all the ads were placed like January 1 and ran for a month, which included the MMA annual convention, which recruiting was done there. We had 60 applications. We identified a group of 17 for further consideration. Then we had a set of essay questions. This was something that was suggested by the consultant we hadn't done before. And that went to the group of 17, and then out of that, we selected 8 for interviews with the committee, which we held over 3 nights. And from this group of 8, we unanimously agreed to a slate of 5 candidates and sent those on to the selectmen, unranked, just straight alphabetical order. And then they were interviewed, a decision was made, an offer made, and contract issued. We attended those interviews, but we did not participate. Our opinion was not asked, and then we dissolved last month, and we're very proud of the process. Just one thing on the applications. I mean, people say, well, or we said to ourselves, even as a committee, how are we going to know? 60 applications, how do you know? You'd be surprised. There's something about a gut reaction that you can skim through 60 applications and almost unanimously come up with, in this case, 17 people that we all agreed were worthy of further investigation. So just to give you that comfort level, I think it's pretty obvious when you're looking for specific experience and background. The only scary thing is not for us, not for the town, but when you think about our children or grandchildren, if you've ever done anything bad and it's in Google, that's a really big problem.
Even if it's in high school.
Right, before. Yeah, indeed. So that's our experience. Not telling you what to do, though.
Yes, maybe we just ask, it became public, or the candidates became public when the select board interviewed them, right?
When we sent the names to the
Select board,
selectmen,
then
then
that
it's
became,
public.
yeah, thank you very much. That's good. Thank you, you've all been terrific. Carl?
Well, good morning. Again, my name is Carl Valente. I just retired as town manager of Lexington, where I was town manager for 13 years. And actually feel I have a pretty good sense of Concord. One, being your neighbor, and I regularly interact and work with Chris, particularly around issues of Hanscom. We have a HATS committee. And also, my wife, Maureen, worked for Tony Legabo for a number of years before she then moved on and became a town manager of Sudbury.
We plant good seeds.
So I knew Tony well, as again, I know Chris well. I don't think I could disagree with anything I've heard this morning. I think everything you've heard is very good advice, even if you're not giving advice or suggesting. Good process that you've heard about. I know that Concord is known as being a quality community. And so I suspect you'll get good candidates because of that. And those of us in the business, we know where the quality communities are because we talk a lot among town managers, and we know those you want to maybe not. Having said that, it is a very challenging time to hire not only town managers, but finance directors, town engineers, public works directors, and so forth. But since we're here talking about town managers, if you think about the neighborhood right now, in terms of communities in this area, so Lexington just hired a town manager, Weston just hired a new town manager, Bedford just hired a new town manager, Sudbury 2 years ago, new town manager, Wayland just hired a town manager, Burlington, Acton, and Littleton's just about to start their process.
Boxborough.
So in Boxborough, yes, as well. So unfortunately, many of my colleagues, like myself, we all sort of came in about the same time, and we're all retiring at the same time. And we as a profession have not done a great job in advocating for young people to come into the profession, which is a wonderful, wonderful profession. I wouldn't have changed a day in it of my 40 years of practicing. But it is going to be that challenge. And I appreciate Nancy talking about the number of applications, but she quickly clarified afterwards, many people, they put in their search engine manager, and you get people who have managed, retail stores and so forth. And in Lexington, I believe it was either 45 or 48 applications. Only 10 met the qualifications that they established. And of that 10, the screening committee only had 3 that they could recommend to the Board of Selectmen. So it will be challenging. Lexington, like Acton, did hire an outside firm to help them. Also the same firm, MRI, Municipal Resources. And in fact, if it's of any help, Tom, I drafted the RFP for the consultant. The consultant asked me to do that, so rather than have to...
We may be in touch.
Reinvent the wheel. I'm sure that Chris could get that from my colleagues in Lexington. But there's a lot of similarities between the two communities. I had an opportunity to review your charter. And actually, our charter, the Lexington Charter, which was 50 years old this year, it was approved in 1968, is very similar to the Concord Charter. So whatever was in the water back then, there's a lot of similarities between the two charters. So one of the things, I'm going to talk about 3 things. One, I was asked to talk about what's the difference between a town manager and a town administrator. And you heard both Tom and Arthur talk about we have a strong town manager. Well, what does that mean? So I'll talk about that a little bit. I was asked to talk about how do you make it work with a town manager? So I can give you from my perspective some of the keys to making it work. And then the last thing I'll add is what I call my 80-20 rule, the 80%, 20% rule. I'm sure you've all heard about the 80-20 rule. I'm going to talk about that in the context of municipal management. So starting with, the difference between a manager and an administrator. And particularly if, you have a screening committee and you get a resume that says town administrator, how should you look at that? So one thing I'll tell you is, the titles themselves may not tell you, doesn't tell you a whole lot. There are town managers, which are weak town manager positions, and there are town administrators, which are very strong town administrators, very similar to a town manager. I'll give you 2 examples. Brookline has a town administrator, but it's the same authority as many town managers have. The person was just hired in Lexington was a town manager in Westboro, but it was a very weak town manager position. So I wouldn't say don't get hung up on that title, but what's the difference? So a strong town manager, similar to Concord, has the authority generally to appoint most staff, and terminate staff, to establish compensation for non-union positions. A town manager would typically recommend the operating and capital budget to either the Board of Selectmen or in some cases the town meeting. A strong town manager will appoint some boards and committees. Usually a Board of Selectmen or a Select Board do most of them, but in the case of Lexington and many town manager positions, the town manager appoints some of those boards and committees. A strong town manager will have the ability to enter into contracts with vendors, construction contracts, services contracts. A strong town manager will be able to organize and reorganize town departments, which is very important because things change, and having the ability to reorganize a department based on skill levels and changes and demands for services is very important. And something that I found very helpful to do when I was in Lexington is to reorganize town departments. Under the Lexington charter, the manager could do that with the approval of the Board of Selectmen. Strong town managers tend to have responsibility for the management and oversight of town property and to approve expense and payroll warrants. So those are sort of the key characteristics of a strong town manager position. I noticed in Concord's charter and in Lexington, it was the Board of Selectmen that appoints town council, I believe. I know it is in Lexington. And actually, all 3 communities share the same town council, Anderson and Krieger, the firm. And I think in both of our communities, the town accountant is appointed by the Board of Selectmen. And that's sort of a throwback to an earlier time, but tends to be something you see reserved for a select board is to appoint their finance official. So how to make it work? Some of the things to make it work, this relationship, and you've had a 25-year relationship with Chris, so you know how to make it work with Chris because you've been at it for so long. So one is sort of the roles between the selectman, the manager, and the staff. And I'll give you the analogy of, I'll use the word urban planner just for the sake of this argument, the urban planner, the architect, and the general contractor. So a manager wants the board to be the planners, to set the broad policy direction for any number of issues, but things that really speak to the culture of the community. There's no better group than a select board that understands the culture of the community, can set that broad direction for the manager. The manager then becomes the architect, puts together the pieces to reach those goals that the selectmen have set. And any of you have done a house project and you've worked with an architect, the architect comes back with something and you say, well, that's not quite what we had in mind, and you send the architect back. And that's what the relationship should be with the manager. The manager will come back with different options, and the board hopefully will look at those and help fine tune those. And then the departments, and the department has become your general contractor. They're the ones who implement that. It's certainly important in this day and age for a manager to have strong collaboration skills. It's probably one of the 3 most important things I was involved in as a manager, is be able to collaborate. And it's not just collaborating with the selectmen, that's easy because that's what you do every day, but it's to collaborate with all the boards and committees that the community has. And Lexington, like Concord, has more committees than I could even keep track of. But that's so important. That really keeps the town government close to the community. And with other community groups, whether it's the League of Women Voters, the Lions Club, the Rotary, neighborhood organizations, nonprofit groups that interact, the clergy association, I worked very closely with the local clergy association in Lexington, and they're a very important part of the community. To have regular communications with the Board of Selectmen and other boards and committees. So that may seem like a no-brainer, have regular communications. That's not as easy as it sounds, particularly given the open meeting law and some of the things you have to comply with. So, I would have many situations where a selectman, our selectmen had regular office hours in town hall, and I would talk to them on a one-on-one basis, and they, would ask me a question: what's happening with X, Y, Z? And I, say, well, here's the status, fill them in. But I would always have to think about, now there's 4 other selectmen that didn't get the same answer, or didn't get an answer because they didn't ask the question. So what is the manager's approach for keeping the full board involved in those types of discussions, keeping them up to date? I would say when you're looking at a manager, and people say, well, how does the manager and the board, how they interact? Are they, is one a check and balance on the other? And, sort of what's that relationship? I describe it as flip sides of the same coin. So the selectmen are on one side of the coin, again, setting policy and direction, and the manager's on the other side of that same coin, implementing that policy and direction. The manager needs to be responsive to the board on many of those day-to-day issues. I can imagine, and I know those phone calls you get, or somebody who stops you in CVS or the grocery store and says, why is this still like this? And so what do? You call up the manager and say, why is this still like this? And those are really important.
That's why we have a move.
That's a really important role.
It's the phone call.
To be responsive to that. It's because, let's face it, the manager is out there, but he doesn't have the same visibility as a select board. And your select board, the one, again, who's in the grocery store, on the soccer fields, or whatever, hearing those types of questions. It's important to make the sort of the relationship work, that a manager is one who's comfortable in responding to a board, not giving them a single answer, but giving options and alternatives for a board to consider. You've heard in a couple of instances here about the importance of integrity, honesty, high ethical standards. I couldn't agree more. What I suggested to the Lexington board when they did their recruiting process is that they include as one of the requirements that the manager be a member of ICMA, the International City County Management Association, or the MMA, the Mass Municipal Management Association. And the reason I suggested that to the board and they agreed is both organizations have a code of ethics that managers are required to comply with. And it's a much more stringent code of ethics than the state code of ethics, which is in itself pretty stringent. But that's one way to send a message to your manager about the importance of high ethical standards. Some of the other things to be aware of, to talk to your candidates about. Many times, the town manager here in Concord is responsible for hiring decisions. Almost all positions are appointed by the town manager. How are you going to handle, Mr. Manager, if you're a manager here, when one of the board members says, I got a call from so-and-so, they're really interested in this position, they've lived in the town for, 32 years, they think they'd be a great, you name the position. How are you going to handle that and hear what the manager candidate says? One of the things that is a challenge between a board and a manager is regarding personnel matters. We have great municipal employees, but not every municipal employee is great. And the board knows that. They know where the weak links are, but the manager can't share what he's doing on personnel matters. So that can be one that you should have a discussion about. How do you handle those types of situations? And the last important thing I would suggest is for the relationship between the board and the manager. The board is a tremendous asset of being the eyes and ears of the community. You're going to hear things, some that are valid, some that are not, but you'll hear things that the manager won't hear because, one, you have 5 times as many eyes and ears, and those eyes and ears from the select board are out in the community. But it's important for the board members to share that information with the manager, so the manager has that benefit of hearing what's out there in the community. So lastly, I'm going to finish up with the 80-20 rule. So 80% of what a town manager or town administrator does, can do it here in Concord, Lexington, Brookline, whatever. It's, you're doing budgets, you're negotiating collective bargaining contracts, you're doing RFPs. It's not a lot different. I've worked in 3 different communities. And 80% of that work, if you've been in the business for, and I assume you're going to probably want someone who's been around for at least 10 years to come to Concord, you're going to have experience doing all of that. And again, it's not going to vary that much from community to community. What's important is the other 20% in selecting your next manager. So the other 20% is about the fit between the manager and the community. And again, I'll use my own example. I worked in Needham, Weston, and Lexington, all right along 128. I didn't vary far as I moved up, but each community had a very different culture to them, a very different culture. The culture in Lexington couldn't have been a better fit for me. I was comfortable there. I was comfortable with the way they approach governance in the community. But that was different than the Weston experience and the Needham experience. And so having that fit is going to be your biggest challenge in hiring your next manager, is will that fit be there? So how do you know that? How do you figure that out? So that's a challenge. So what I would argue is, during the process that you heard Nancy talk about, I'm sure most of that process was the screening committee and the Board of Selectmen interviewing the manager candidates. What about the other way around? What's the opportunity for the candidates to interview the community members, to understand the culture of the community? We tend not to build that into the process, a way of doing that. So how do managers do that? How do they, when you're considering a community? So what managers do, and what I did is, and I'm sure people will do that here in Concord, is they'll talk to Chris if they're considering. They'll say, Chris, tell me about the select board. I watched some of the video from a select person's meeting, and tell me about this Tom guy, But having them, making those types of resources available to your manager candidates will go a long way in making sure that they're going to be comfortable working here in Concord, as well as you being comfortable with them. And then the last part of the 80-20 rule that I'll mention, and Nancy talked about this as well, and as did Arthur, is the most important thing that a manager does, I believe, is regarding staff. Hiring, developing, promoting staff. We don't manufacture widgets in town government. We provide services, and we provide services to our residents with staff. And you heard Arthur talk about, I think, one of the qualities that Chris had in terms of developing staff. And so I would say that's a very important part of this 20% of the job that you should ask about, is how have you done that in your community? Today, we don't, and even I'll use even at the lower levels of town government, whether you're talking about administrative staff or public works staff or whatever, in most cases, you're hiring people who are, have a college, either associate's or bachelor's degree. They want to feel that they're part of the process of running the town. And the manager making sure that there are mechanisms for all staff to have a professional development plan, to sort of feel that they're contributing to the community, that they're part of the decision process. And it's a challenge because, the professional development plan for one individual is going to look very different than another individual, just because of where they are in their life. But there's nothing more important, and it sounds like Chris, this is one of the areas he excelled in, was in hiring good staff and developing and promoting that. And so I think talking with your candidates about that, how they handle that in their previous communities, what's their experiences and so forth, is a key part of hiring a quality manager.
Thank you. What an extraordinary education we've just been given in the process of considering and hiring and searching for a town manager. The credit for that goes not only to these four speakers, but to those who asked them, invited them, and organized them. And so I want to thank Artis, I want to thank Ingrid, I want to thank Carlin, and I want to thank Dory. And Anita Techley, who's just not here, but thank you, Anita, on a beach in Hawaii.
So she's missing this beautiful fall
Can
day
you
in Wayne?
imagine? I don't know why she didn't plan her vacation differently. For helping us to put this extraordinary panel together to provide us with such a rich education. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn it over to our gathering. My first question is, when you were working with your consultant and when you were thinking about hiring, or when you collectively imagine who this next person might be, how broad is your search? Do you tend to believe it's going to be a Massachusetts person, a person within New England, or do you cast this net all the way to California, Alaska, Hawaii, and back again? And what of the 60 candidates, for instance, that you saw are in your imagination, imagine you're going to be considering? Can you address that question for us first? Nancy?
Well, we did through the ICMA, that's an international organization, so the ad went into their publication, so theoretically it was seen by anybody outside of Massachusetts. We also advertised in the MMA, Beacon, and other similar recruitment type things. In the end, out of 60, I would say probably 40 were New England. Mm-hmm. We had some from Vermont, maybe a couple from Connecticut, one from Rhode Island and so forth, but some from Illinois, I remember, but they never the ones that were far away, the importance of understanding Massachusetts municipal finance seems to kind of overrule. I mean, it's a very challenging thing for someone who lives in Illinois to come and try to understand municipal finance right off the bat. On the other hand, maybe they don't have to excel in finance and can excel in other things. But in the end, all of the finalists were New England people.
Or New England
Yeah.
candidates.
Yeah.
Anybody else
Well,
wish to comment on that?
Yeah, when I was approached about running for the select board, one of the people I went to talk to was Chris, and he informed me he'd just been given a 3-year contract and was probably going to retire after. So it didn't come as a total shock to me that we might be looking. And the Mass Municipal Association annual meeting, they always have these symposiums, smaller meetings, and they usually have a meeting regarding the search for a town manager. So I've been attending those. And the advice that was given is just to say there are, when you're advertising, it generally is a national, you probably will only get a candidate where, for whatever reason, they may have grown up in Massachusetts or New England, they may be in California, the Midwest, wherever, for whatever reason, their spouse may be coming back east, and they're moving for that purpose. So it's unlikely, but you should still go ahead and make sure that you've got an opening, because you don't want to miss anybody.
Anybody
Yeah.
in that process?
Yeah.
Can I just add just 2 quick thoughts to that?
Of course.
And I would agree with both of them. One is, I know a number of my colleagues who came from outside of Massachusetts who are managers. And so while Nancy is right, it's certainly easier for somebody who's here and understands the municipal laws. It's easier for them to make the transition. I've seen a number of people come from outside of Massachusetts who've done very well here. The managers group puts on monthly training sessions for them. The other challenge in terms of just getting somebody from outside of Massachusetts is our high cost of living. You may have a very qualified candidate, and when they find out that, to live in Concord, if it's a $750,000 house, they're going to tear it down. It's sort of the high price of housing really discourages people from who could otherwise would be very quality candidates.
For making that transition. Thank you. A second question is that we have such a strong committee structure in our town. A lot of chairmen of various committees who in many ways consider themselves autonomous in their activity and in their work. And particularly their commission consider themselves really autonomous, from the work of the select board or the town manager. Do you think that's going to discourage candidates who may not come from a system that has a committee structure, as well as we describe ourselves as having a strong town manager system? So do you think that's going to, how do we present that, one? And two, do you think that's going to discourage some candidates?
Well, I'll talk about that a little. We have a good degree of autonomy in Concord, but as I mentioned in my remarks, the boss is the town manager. If there's a legal issue that comes up, for example, that committee doesn't go out and engage counsel. They have to work through the town manager, and that's exactly as it should be, because you're getting into budget issues, and you don't want situations where you have the planning board as an example, in a confrontation with the Natural Resources Commission, or Public Works in confrontation. And a lot of that gets sorted out by the strong town manager, who gives direction and collaborates, as Carl mentioned, with the department head. So that when you have those kinds of issues, you try to nip them in the bud at the staff level, and if the personalities are a little too strong, there may be a conversation that the town manager has with that person, or the select board chair has with that. And I'll give you an example. there was an issue with the Concord Light Board many years ago when, after some litigation, the town got, or thought they were going to get $50 million against then Boston Edison. Well, on appeal, the $50 million was reduced substantially. But at that point, we had a light board which really thought, under the statute, which is a separate statute that authorizes the creation of light boards and how they function, they thought they were truly independent. And this was an issue that was going on in other communities around the state. And from Chris's point of view, he had to rein them in, and that was a matter of who does the director of the light board report to,
right.
and what's the line of authority. And there was ultimately a memorandum of understanding developed between the town manager, select board, and the light board to resolve that issue. But these things come up, it's natural, it's evolutionary, and you deal with them.
You do. Nancy?
I would just add that you kind of have to trust a candidate to decide whether this is a fit or, what issues might be. Googling works both ways. And these candidates know everything about the town. They can watch selectmen's meetings as they're happening. They can look at all of the taped meetings. They read all the minutes online. There isn't much they don't know. And I think you have to trust in the end
That the research goes both ways.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's so important that we have had the long-range plan, because I think that really lays out to a candidate an awful lot about the town,
Right.
and the seriousness with which we sort of take local government.
Right.
So I think that's a huge advantage. I don't know whether Lexington or Acton, when you were doing your search, when the previous long-range plan had been, and how much that got used.
I don't know about how much it got used, but I remember of the 5 finalists, at least 2 quoted the long-range plan, so they had done their homework on it and understood the goals.
That's an exquisite and important comment. Those were the kind of planned comments, so yes, Dr. Rogers.
I just remember doing research into various towns as part of committee work for the town, and discovering that for most towns, the long-range plan was simply done by an outside consultant. It was pretty damn lousy compared to what was done by Concord.
So that's a vote for our long-range plan, for people to lean on that when they're...
I would also comment, I don't think there's that many people here, and this is probably something that's incredibly important.
I know.
And there ought to be more people here.
Well,
And I don't know how, I'm glad you're recording it, because I think there should be some effort to encourage citizens to view this meeting and view what these people said.
Well, we'll do everything we can. I think you couldn't be more right. And I think that the thoughtful maturity and insight they've provided makes it even more important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're spot on. Yes, Louise.
Hi, this is probably a question for Nancy, but actually for everybody. When you get to the point where you have gotten to the finalists, and their names have been usually at that point public, at what point do the finalists get to talk to the staff? My experience has been with school things, and this is town's a little different, but I'm wondering if there is a place where the person would then meet with the cross-section of the staff.
We did not. They did not meet with the staff. In fact, it happened very quickly. The names were submitted to the selectmen the first week of April. Our town meeting was the second Monday of April. And so the selectmen, we'd laid out the schedule in advance. They did not want to deal with interviews or anything else until town meeting was over. So that took a couple of weeks before the interviews could be made. I know the school process. We were going through a new superintendent hire at the same time. It was very different. They go around, they meet with PTAs, the candidates and so forth. I can't conceive of that happening with a town manager process. I don't think it would have been fair. I like Carl's idea of having them be able to ask questions, in this case would be of the selectmen about the community and so forth. But we didn't even have that process.
Anne?
Well, sort of in line with that, I noticed that you commented that the search committee, I think, I didn't write it all down, was basically all former officials appointed and elected, it sounded like, without any current officials or community people. And again, the school committee process, of the school superintendent hiring process here in Concord a couple of years ago, the search committee, but it wasn't called that, had current, as I guess there are going to be a couple of current people on the search committee, and then it had other official people who worked in the schools, but it also had community people. So I'm wondering why you all made the choice not to have just regular community people who could have a lot of experience, but it's not within a municipal government on the search committee.
Well, we did have, there were current FinCom members on the committee, and, like I'm chairman of the Community Housing Corporation, so I was on the committee. I mean, there were people on the committee who were currently in boards.
But everybody was a
affiliated
connection
somehow,
as opposed to
yeah.
just a community.
Those are the names the selectmen generated. And technically, they are a cross-section of the town. They just maybe serve on different boards or have different experiences, but that's what the selectmen put together.
In the sense, I'm thinking it sort of keeps everything within the box, and you don't have some people from outside of the box who could bring in new ideas. But
Yeah.
that was the choice, and clearly that was a choice.
Well, really, the number one requirement was you had to have a working knowledge of town
The
government.
town government and how it
So
functions.
that's the
David.
experience.
On the subject of the cost of housing in Concord, I believe it's correct that with the current town manager here, the select board of the time did take steps financially to make it affordable for a family to buy into Concord. So a crucial point, but there's a precedent in town, if I'm correct, and I believe that I am, for easing that problem. To follow on Anne's line of thought here, and I profusely apologize for not having been here to hear what doubtless has already been said, but clearly the next step here that's vital is the selection of the screening committee. If there could be a bit of expansion on that subject, frankly, I'd be grateful. I think Anne's question has raised a key point. The folks who are on that screening committee are going to determine really who we get and the quality of what we get.
I announced it, sorry, you weren't here, is that we're going to have a 9-member committee. We've already voted on the criteria in general. There are going to be 2 current select board members, the 2 with the service, longest service, which is Alice Kaufman and Mike Lawson. And then there will be 7 others that we hope to have nominations on October the 15th, our next select board meeting. There have been a number of suggestions. I think we will have people in the public who have not necessarily been widely known as being on committee after committee. One of the other issues is we're hoping to perhaps have a town manager who will serve 10 or more years. So we want to make sure that a number of the people on the committee are of the age that they will be participating in government for those 10 or more years. A little bit younger group, but yes.
Could you explain?
I tried to put that as delicately. I'm afraid the group is pretty sharp this morning.
That your specialty, Tom.
So I think that we're still in the process of, one of the problems I'm finding is trying to get a hold of people who no longer have landlines, or no longer phone numbers in the town book, so trying to locate and be in touch with everybody, but it sounds like somewhat similar to Acton's approach. I have asked all of the other board members to provide me with a list of 7 to 10 names of people they think would be useful. Having discussed separately with each one that we want kind of a wider variety. Ideally, if somebody's got experience with in the business world with hiring people, that's a skill level. So we're looking as much for skill levels as we are necessarily for a great deal of prior town government experience.
If I could, let me applaud your pointing out the possibility for those who haven't been appointed to committees over and over and over again. I think it's one of the issues in Concord governance, frankly, that comes to be an in-group. Once again, let me applaud for that. Tom, are you making the fact that you're going to advance nominations at this meeting publicly known, widely publicly known, and perhaps inviting nominations from the constituency that elected you?
That so far doesn't seem to. We've gotten a number of people who have expressed a potential interest in serving, and we have, at the various meetings, and such as a forum like today, made it known that this is a process that we are engaging in. So, does everybody know? I'm sure they don't, but we've done what we can, and I think we've got a pretty good group.
Well, if I may, let me encourage getting the word around town. We've got, 17,000 inhabitants. Ain't everybody gonna find out?
You can be an assistant town crier. I think we've elected Steve Ning as the official town crier, so I didn't want to give that position away.
This is gonna be our Supreme Court nomination.
Stefan, I think was next, yes.
Good follow-on, Tom, you stole my thunder, but the point still is on the age. I mean, you want somebody who's old enough to have had 10 years of experience. You want someone who's young enough to be around for 10 or more years. Can you put that in the requirements or?
No.
What is the typical contract term these days? I have seen that the tenure of school superintendents and presidents of universities and so on is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and given the effort that it takes to do a search, hopefully you get the right person, you want them to stay for a while.
I think Chris's contracts have been 3-year contracts, and I assume that that's probably what will continue. I don't know whether that's generally the standard, I think. That
Is about 3 years.
Yeah.
And then one hopes, of course, that that's just the beginning of what becomes a kind of serial set of reappointments.
If you put out that you're out there, that you were looking for a 5-year contract, would you get a different pool of candidates?
I think you get a different risk as well.
True. Yeah.
So I'm not sure. I mean, that we'll be probably open to hearing suggestions as we go along, but I would say right now that there hasn't been a great deal of discussion of changing the 3-year.
Pattern, Nancy.
It's 2 questions I'd like to ask. One, if you're able to say it, what salary range are you offering? And 2 is, are you going to continue to require that the town manager live in town?
It's not a requirement.
It's not a requirement. It's a number 1. So the answer to that is no. The compensation package, I think, will be something that will be addressed as we get a little bit further along to kind of see what the pool is like and what the requirements may be needed. If we're talking about somebody who is coming from out of state, you know, there may be other issues involved, and so I think that that's something which doesn't get addressed until you're kind of negotiating at the end point. I would be surprised if it's not going to be maybe a higher amount than even what is currently.
I could just add, just to give you an example, of our 5 finalists, 2 were in their 30s, 2 were in their 40s, and 1 in their 50s. And the one that was chosen was 38 years old.
That's very
Interesting.
Yes, Linda.
Thank you for your good descriptions of the process and so forth. One question I have is specific, as you look back, and if you can say so, were there points in your process that you wish you had done differently, or that you would have strengthened, or, I'm not sure.
The essay questions bothered me, I guess. We hadn't done them originally, but this was something the consultant recommended, and it was one of the features of their recruiting efforts, is essay questions. But they were long. I mean, we told them to only write 2 paragraphs, and there were 5 questions. Some of the questions had 5 parts to them. And, so it was like a lot of reading for us, but in the end, once again, it jumps out who has the ability to communicate. Now, if someone doesn't have the ability to have good written communication, they could be great in all other areas, but that comes in front of us and, that person is gone. So it kind of bothered me, and I don't know how I would have done it differently, but
Thank you.
yeah.
What were some of the questions that you collectively either, and Art, from your experience in gathering new folks over these years, and as in Nancy, in your experience, and questions you've been asked, Carl, what questions have proven most insightful? The kind of question that has caused you to perk up and say, "Well, am I glad I asked that question?"
Well, I'll tell you, the one that hit the ball out of the park was the final question. We had standard questions for the interviews so that everybody was on the same page. The final question for each candidate was, what would you like to tell us that we haven't asked you about? And there were some fascinating answers to it, yeah.
I'd like to, Carl, you mentioned the importance of the town charter, but I'm just curious, is this on the town web? If I wanted to look at the charter for Concord, where would it be? On the web?
Yes.
Okay.
Are there other questions? Yes, Carla.
I'm a little concerned about the timeline for completing the search process. We're less than a year time between now and Chris is supposed to be leaving. Do you think we'll make the deadline?
Yes.
Well, with that confident and succinct response, I thank you all for coming very much. I thank you all for enlightening us and teaching us so much this morning. And thank Fowler for letting us use this fantastic space. And CCTV, thank you very much for recording this. Now MMN. And thank you for recording for us. That will be an invaluable resource for people to watch and observe as this search goes forward, including those people who are eventually on this committee. This will be an invaluable tape. So thank you all very much.